Welcome back. We hope you enjoyed already the first half of this morning, have taken some coffee, are fully energized again. Is that the case? Perfect. Looking forward to that. My name is Sophia Gamp. You might have seen me already this morning here on stage. And I have Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook here next to me.
I'm Catherine Kluwer-Ashbrook. I'm the Executive Vice President of the Bertelsmann Stiftung in Berlin. But for the function of these next 2 days, I am here to support these three remarkable women, Deborah, Alicia, and Sophia, the 24 members of their core team, and of course the 400 volunteers who are working tirelessly to make everything happen, from your coffee to your guidance to getting you in this room.
We take great pleasure in leading you or guiding you through the 53rd St. Gallen Symposium as your conference hosts.
And I should say, we conferred before, but they have invited 1 or 2 men for gender balance.
Don't worry, the men in the team had a tough year, but you will see them here on stage as well. After the following panel, we will break for lunch. As we, the International Students Committee, not only want to talk about this year's topic, confronting scarcity, but we also want to live it, we decided to keep the food exclusively vegetarian and mostly regional. So the following lunch you will have will be totally Swiss cuisine from all regions in Switzerland. So you can have the opportunity to enjoy what Switzerland has to offer you. If you want to know more about our vegetarian concept, you can have some more information on the screens that are in the catering area.
And even though this is the 30th year anniversary of my own vegetarianism, I had absolutely no input to this brilliant decision. But the goal is to see how we, as this community, over these next 2 days, can really reduce our own carbon footprint by consuming responsibly, vegetarian, vegan, but above all, responsibly. We heard this morning from Karin Keller-Sutter, from Carsten Spohr, how businesses are finding themselves in this dueling pressure of needing predictability, stability, rules-based order among an environment which increasingly feels like a geoeconomic and geopolitical hurricane. And at the same time, internally, their shareholders, but also their stakeholders, and we as consumers are raising the demands that we have of the companies that provide us goods and services. We want them to be at the vanguard of mitigating unintended externalities, at the vanguard of thinking what sustainability is. We want them to be partners in these societal endeavors of changing the way that we do business. So they feel it's not enough to just deliver for shareholders proper, but they need to be responsible stakeholders. And that's also one of the findings of the annual survey that St. Gallen runs with the Nuremberg Institute of Market Decisions, the flagship study that we do, St. Gallen does every year. And we found some precisely those findings, but with a little bit more nuance. And so this year, the report surveyed 650 leaders of tomorrow, some of whom are in this very room, and 250 C-suite executives from the world's largest companies. And Sophia will take us through the findings.
As you not yet can see, oh, here we go. As you can see on the screen, there's a notable discrepancy in perceptions regarding what corporations are currently doing to address the scarcity and of mainly natural resources and what they should be doing. While 88% of our leaders of tomorrow see a huge responsibility and believe that businesses should address this topic to a large or to a very large extent, only 22% of them feel that companies are currently making enough efforts in this area. Additionally, there's a surprising level of agreement between the generations. Current senior executive, hence the leadership of companies, share this assessment.
So how do business leaders cope with these dueling pressures that they confront every day? How do they adapt their leadership practice? How do they respond to the needs and demands of their boards where there are conflicting voices even there? And how do they navigate risk and uncertainty while having these internal conversations. And fundamentally, because we are a global gathering here, what can we learn from one another, both in the corporate sector, but also in terms of social responsibility, on how we might bring those elements into less of conflict and more into audacious solutions? That's the theme of our next panel, and we both are thrilled to welcome Manas Chawla, the CEO of London Politica, to the stage, who will guide you through the conversation.
Good morning, everyone. Gosh, where's all the energy? It's only day one. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. There we go. Now, I have the task of keeping you from your lunch, but that's not going to be a hard thing because what we've got on stage is a truly all-star panel that I'm going to introduce briefly. I'm going to lead the panel for about half an hour, and then we'll turn to you for an audience Q&A for half an hour. So first, we have Roshni Nadar Malhotra, the new co-chairperson of the Gallen Symposium, and of course, the chairperson of HCLTech, a leading global technology organization in India with a market cap of 34 billion. We have Geiser, the CEO of FGS Global, a leading strategic advisory and communications firm specializing in corporate reputation and crisis management. And of course, Lindiwe Mazibuko, who's a South African public leader, writer, and academic fellow. And she was also the first Black woman in South African history to be elected leader of the opposition in parliament. Roshni, let me start with you, because in your opening remarks this morning, you spoke really incisively about a kind of scarcity that can be quite overlooked sometimes, a scarcity of leadership, and how it can come from the unlikeliest of places. And like you said to me over breakfast this morning, the thing with diamonds are that they're found in the rough. So my question is, what are you doing? And what do you advise business leaders to do who want to find the best young talent, not just where it's accessible, but also where it's most overlooked?
All right, thank you so much. So again, I'm going to give you just an example of something that we're doing or trying in our company. I think business leaders today, especially in organizations and industries such as ours, like for example, in our company, we have 250,000 people. And of the 250,000 people, at least 60 to 70% of the people we source directly from engineering colleges, majority in India, and then of course from other geographies in which we are present, the largest being outside India being the US. The cohort that we induct is called freshers, fresh engineers. 6 years ago, and I'm a chair of a technology company, but I am not an engineer. In fact, I did my undergrad in film and television, and then somewhere along the line, my parents told me, please go and do business school, something normal. So I did business school. Now, normal is also very subjective. And so I'm a chair of a tech company, and one of the questions we asked ourselves 7 years ago was, why do they need to be engineers? I mean, if you don't say they do have to be engineers, then I guess the pool opens up to the rest of the world, to every field. So we embarked on this experiment, and we call them tech bees. And in India, we started inducting from smaller towns, so looking at aspiration and looking at access to opportunities of large companies. We started accessing directly grade 12 students from schools. So, and when you're in grade 12, because you are not corrupted by engineering, and you are, but you have just completed, the first journey, and in a lot of ways, I think the most defining journey of your growth till grade 12. you are young girls and young boys who, at least in today's world, are digital natives. So unlike, the boomers or the millennials, I mean, these kids are growing up with technology that even parents can't keep up. So they're already digital natives. We partner with universities as a company, BITS Pilani, Shastra University, our own universities in our group. So we induct Tech Bs, which are grade 12 students, and because you induct them directly from grade 12, we're able to keep a good balance of gender, because you already haven't had a filtration of girls who haven't gone into STEM. So you've got 50% girls, 50% boys coming directly from tier 2 cities, aspiring to work in a company in India, which is in the top 20 companies in India. And they start earning from day one. And to be able to earn at 18 or 19, working in a top company in India, coming from a small town, is highly empowering. How we connect the dots is we partner with the universities who provide scholarships, and every Saturday and Sunday you attend university to get a BTech degree. So you're still pursuing engineering, but you're also working. And maybe this is not so new to Europe where you've got apprenticeship programs, but I promise you in India, telling an Indian parent that after school you are not going to go to a university and you're going to go to work, they're like, what are you talking about? And just creating that. And so by the time a Tech B at HCLTech is 24, 25, not only do they have an undergraduate degree in engineering, but they have 5 years of experience, which otherwise you would be graduating from engineering and then you'd be applying for a job at HCL. So it's design thinking how you source talent and where you source talent from. And it was amazing because there was a lot of challenges that we had internally, culturally, because how will 18-year-olds and 19-year-olds interact in teams with engineers who are 22, 23, and they're like, what do these kids know? How will managers perceive these kids? So many things change. But it's been 6 years. We have 10,000 Tech Bs in the company. Now, in our universe of 250,000, it's very small, but that's 10,000 more than any of my competitors have. So I'm happy. Yeah.
Amazing. Alex, let me go to you. I was at dinner last night and somebody joked with me that the hardest job in the world right now is to be the director of a university in the United States. We've all seen what's happening at college campuses across the US, where young people are coming out in scores to support the Palestinian cause, to camp out. And it's clear the young people care about this. It's clear they want their leaders to take a stand. But I want to know, what's your advice to public leaders, business leaders that are looking to navigate really complex, geopolitically driven crises like these, that want to bring their stakeholders together? We live in a stakeholder economy, you said. Stakeholders that are so polarized, but also while doing that, want to take a stand that keeps their moral and ethical foundations up front.
Well, there's no one size fits all, but the world, and then you touched on something that's important for everybody to digest and actually process properly. The world actually has moved from a shareholder economy to the stakeholder economy. And that is very, very important for everybody to really process properly, because it is making it more difficult for leaders to lead. So when these questions come up, and it's not just university presidents, it's been political leaders, they've been exposed to it forever, even 500 years ago and longer. But for business leaders, it's new. And I would even say for academic leaders, it is new-ish. So the advice you're getting, at least if you're coming, to about 2,500 leaders getting advised by our firm, the general position I take is the following: take a step back from the issue and start way beforehand. Number one, be positive, right? We heard it earlier. If you're not a positive leader and you live your values every day and you're transparent about what's important to you and what you stand for, and you communicate it and you live it, you're not going to have any credibility when you choose to engage on something. The second part is your organization has a footprint, an overarching footprint. And that's where you can put your money where your mouth is and actually choose and relatively, exert control as to making the world a better place. Your little piece, but you can. And if you do that, you build up institutional credibility. And then you have the third dimension, and that I would say is the deep personal dimension. Are you a leader who truly cares about something deeply? Be open about it. Take that step. And a lot of leaders, actually, you're not going to believe it, are actually introverts. So they don't like being out there. They don't like being on stage. It kills them, right? All they want to do is a really good job. But you know what? When you do that and you show everybody that you deeply care as a human being, then it becomes easier for you to withstand the overall global market of issues and politics, because ultimately that's not what you were elected for. You were elected for controlling what you control and not to lead the world. And then you can, if you opt out of something, you can actually say, with all due respect, I am not an expert on X. And when you weigh in on something, people know that your voice has weight. So, that's really how we go about it.
Yeah, it's a really refreshing perspective. Lindiwe, let me go to you, because you're one of the most inspiring political leaders that I've ever had the privilege of meeting. And in many ways, I think you epitomize sort of the voice, the character of the Global South. And in the emerging geopolitical order, I see a system increasingly where there's these so-called middle powers, formerly developing countries, that are paving their own path. They don't see the world in a bipolar lens. They don't look at, do we have to necessarily align with just the US or China or Russia? But also within the Global South, you see foreign policies led by pragmatism. And I think that sometimes means that it doesn't unite around a common ideology in the same way that it could, and a lot is left out in the process. So talk to me a bit more about that, and how optimistic are you about unity within the Global South?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think one of the reasons many states in the Global South, the so-called Global South, I prefer the global majority, have opted out of multilateral institutions that don't give them adequate representation, but make decisions about peacekeeping and intervention without having them at the table, that make economic decisions, monetary policy decisions without having countries from Africa, from Southeast Asia and elsewhere, Latin America, at the table to make these decisions, is because they have felt very much like chess pieces on a board, that they have no power and no voice. And so for those of us who were in Johannesburg, for example, at the last BRICS summit, it felt like there was an opportunity for countries of the Global South, the global majority, to start to build their own institutional frameworks, their own institutions of cooperation and engagement. And while that's wonderful from an economic perspective, there is a danger that the values that many of us hold dear, human rights, accountability, democracy, transparency, are going to fall by the wayside, because the institutions that are supposed to be upholding these values either lock African and other countries out of decision-making and out of representation, or they consider them to be voting fodder when the time comes to head for the vote at the UN. So the sort of changing polarity of the globe, I think, is a healthy challenge to the notion that we have to choose. Are we with the United States? Are we with China? Are we with Russia? It's freed up countries that may not necessarily have the geopolitical heft of those three countries to make decisions that are in the interests of their own people, in the national interest, around how to position themselves on geopolitical issues, while simultaneously opening up space to be able to have pragmatic discussions about trade, about economic engagement, and elsewhere. But I do worry that this multipolarity does risk the kind of dominant belief, which is, I think, reinforced by a lot of people in Africa, for example. An extraordinary organization called Afrobarometer does these kind of permanent surveys in indigenous languages all over the African continent, asking people again and again, what do you prefer as your main form of government? Do you want military dictatorship? Do you want presidents for life? Do you want democratic governance? And decade in and decade out, Africans have been repeatedly saying, we reject military government, we reject presidents for life, we want democratic governance. And they're simultaneously asked, well, do you believe you have a supply of these forms of government? And in many cases, Africans say, no, we don't. The supply is much lower than the demand. So, Africans, for example, are very clear about what kind of government they want, and they're also clear about the fact that they don't have it. So for us to jettison these values, self-determination, accountability, democracy, and so forth, in favor of pragmatism, I think would be dangerous. But that's the risk that is run when these supposedly multilateral institutions, which are actually unipolar, lock out of decision-making, engagement, having a voice, the countries that represent the global majority. BRICS now has a bigger population footprint than the G8. Never mind economic heft that will come if these sort of negotiations around, economic and trade and other agreements start to sort of deliver on sort of economic growth and prosperity. It's very possible that the economics will follow the population. But for the largest, population groups in the world to be left out of international political decision-making, I think is a huge mistake that could end up jeopardizing the sort of dominance of democracy as an ideology and as a way of governing that represents people's aspirations and their voices.
And you spoke about the summit in Johannesburg. Just shortly after that, we have the G20 in India, and there was so much going on in the world right then, also right now. And what was the key sort of message in the communique issued by all the leaders? It wasn't on Russia, Ukraine. It wasn't on the Middle East. It wasn't on climate. It was around creating the need for unity in the global South, and of course the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent, proper, full-time member of the G20 to represent hundreds of millions of people that didn't have a voice in these sort of leading global forums. And speaking of India, Roshni, I'm going to turn to you again, because you lead a tech company that's based out of India, but that has a very large, perhaps the majority of its footprint outside of India. And in the last 5 years, I mean, whenever I go places, I know people around the world, leaders around the world, are trying really hard to understand India. It's an interesting and it's a tough market, and it's one that, again, like I said before, is evolving in its own way, that has its own culture. So what would your advice be to business and public leaders that want to develop their India strategy?
That's a big question. I think I'm not advising anybody on their business, but India is open. I think I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think the recognition of us having the youngest and the largest workforce, and perhaps educated as well. So, just to all global leaders, and I think a lot of them are taking cognizance of it, which is they're coming to India, they're setting up not just IT back office, presence, which they did through the 90s and the 2000s, but actually their strategic, centers in India, especially for their core technologies and core R&D. So, because only when you do that, you allow yourself to explore what India has to offer. And in my mind, given the industry I am, what India really does have to offer is mind and thought, and and if you can leverage that, and it's also what we as a country get from a lot of global companies coming and setting up centers which are core technology or core R&D, and not just back office, is we get a global exposure. India has probably the largest diaspora, a very successful diaspora. But today, given that there are so many opportunities within the domestic market and within India, a lot of young people are also not choosing to move out as much as they did before, but they want to have global experiences. So, it's perhaps what happened in the US in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s. So, just inviting a lot of companies to come and set up some sort of strategic base there. And I think the timing is right. So a lot of people are also doing that because how India has positioned itself in the geopolitical, arena of what is happening in the global South, and how we are navigating our relationships with the neighbors, but how we're also navigating our relationship with, perhaps our largest trade partner today, which is the biggest economy in the world, which is the United States, and a few economies in Europe. So I think that it's the timing is right, and I think that most large companies actually realize that, and also just a burgeoning domestic market.
Yeah, a huge domestic
a huge
market. Yeah.
domestic market, which is still not, I think, tapped to its potential.
Yeah.
Indian companies do very well in Indian domestic markets. Global companies are still figuring out how to do well for a 1.4 billion population. So I think, but you need to have boots on the ground, and people willing to actually move there, live there. It is, as we were talking about earlier, India is organized chaos. So in many places, I can't offer you predictable traffic and predictable air, and we have mind to offer.
Yeah.
So that's all.
It's chaos, things are broken, but things work. They get done at the end of the day.
It keeps moving.
Keeps moving.
It keeps moving.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a bit on global political leadership from the global south. But Alex, let's talk about where we are here today. We're in Switzerland. And some would argue that this country has not done enough in the face of the geopolitical crises we see today, in the face of the atrocities being committed in Ukraine, in Gaza, but also in Sudan. There's a war going on there that people often overlook and we shouldn't forget. And some would say that in this global climate, Switzerland's historic foreign policy neutrality is no longer a tenable ethical position. Would you agree? And what would your message be to the Swiss?
Big question, and I'm sure there's plenty of discussion on both sides. My personal opinion on it would be Switzerland actually is taking a very important step. They know who they are. The nation knows who they are. They know, and they more importantly know who they're not. So for them to, Switzerland knows they're not going to set the global agenda, but what they have done, and they've moved step by step by step, ever so slightly, but they have moved from their traditional positions, which are, hundreds of years old, and they've signaled with that everybody needs to change, and we are also changing. Switzerland's never been a country of radical change, nor do I believe it is going to be one of radical change, nor should it be one of radical change, because that is part of its value proposition. Its stability, it is, we heard earlier, common sense, and you can depend on us, but we are not loudspeakers. We're not going to be out there in the world and tell others what to do, nor are we going to essentially point fingers, but we will adjust the dial, and we will do it without yelling. We will do it slowly. And I think Switzerland's remained true to itself. That would be my view of how they've acted so far.
Yeah. I want to go to some questions sort of for the entire panel now. We've got 200 of the best and brightest young people here. I've come to dozens of these forums, and increasingly there seems to be a youth body everywhere. There's a youth advisory consultative aspect to every big global conversation. But what I'm concerned most about, and this is a word I learned last year at the symposium, is youth washing. Much like greenwashing, this idea that young people are the new sheen and corporates need to engage with them. But often it's done only in a very sort of corporatist, PR way, to be really blunt, not in a way that substantively includes them in their decision making. So for my question for the whole panel is, how do we make sure that our youth is included, not just in a tokenistic, symbolistic way where we fly them out to fancy places for 2 days, but in a way rather that their concerns are heard, measured, and implemented in tangible, concrete ways. Lindiwe, let me start with you.
Well, I come from the world's youngest continent, and my fundamental belief is that young people need to be given power. Not position, not status, actual power. The resources, the mandate, and the ability to actually make concrete decisions about their future, their country's futures, and so forth. I think anything less is, as you say, tokenistic. Certainly from the space I come from in politics, we are a continent of old presidents who've been in power for decades. We're a continent of old, mostly male political leaders who are completely out of touch with the day-to-day experiences of the people they claim to serve. And in fact, they don't serve them, they tend to rule over them. And so I think the solution to the question of whether representation is real is to analyze whether power is real. In politics, in much the same way, we look at the way in which cabinet portfolios are allocated on gender terms. And often you find, the IPU, women political leaders and other organizations have done studies about how women are often allocated the so-called soft portfolios, right? Social development, education, women finance ministers, women defense ministers. I mean, in South Africa, where we've had a 50-50 cabinet since 1994, we have never had a woman finance minister, ever, right? So there are certain portfolios, certain areas of responsibility that are seen as hard portfolios that women are kept away from. If you look at their P&Ls, their budgets, their areas of responsibility that they have, they pale in comparison to those of their male counterparts. I think the same thing is true for young people. If we analyze the actual power that young people have, whether it's on a board, in a corporate, in a political space, are they responsible for budgets? Do they command large teams? Are their programs of action do their programs of action have any real hope of implementation? Or are they just a voice to advise the status quo, to feed into the status quo, and frankly, to legitimate it? That's the important question we have to ask.
Alex?
I would say we're actually very positive for everybody here. We are living in an age where age barriers, traditional age barriers, are being absolutely decimated. If I look at boardrooms 10 years ago, at least in the Western Hemisphere, sorry to say, old white men, lots of gray hair. If you didn't wear a tie, who are you? What are you doing here? Are you serving us a coffee? Irrespective of you're male or female, it didn't matter. And now the people I'm seeing are more individuals literally, and not 5 years younger, but 10 to 20 years younger. And the people really and I think there's power in the seat, and then there's power around the seat, so to say, around leaders. That has moved to late 20s, early 30s. Why? Well, look at the demographic situation, especially in the transatlantic area. It has to happen, and it is happening. It'll take another, I think, 5-6 years for it to become fully visual, but it is already happening. It's fully in force.
Yeah. Just to follow up on that, I mean, is this demand driven? Is it supply driven? Are boards saying we need a youth perspective, or are young people becoming more ambitious, more resilient, and just hustling their way to the top?
I would say all of the above, with one additional dimension, and that's transparency. It was more difficult for leaders to identify top talents in the organization 10 years ago than it is now, because they themselves, I do it myself. I have much greater transparency as to who the real leaders in the organization are across multiple generations of leaders. And that 10 years ago was very much limited. Unless somebody was in a meeting and made a big impression, or you met somebody, then you could take that decision. Or if HR developed, so to say, a class and so on and so on. It was very curated. Now it's become open source, largely, not in each organization, but in most organizations it's become open source, and that is what's breaking essentially the barriers.
Yeah. And just before I turn to Roshni, we are going to be taking questions in just 2 minutes. But Roshni, you lead a very young company. I think you told me sort of the majority of your workforce is under, is it 25, 27? So you think about this a lot. What do you think? What do you do to make sort of youth inclusion actionable?
Well, I think, firstly, like I said, 60 to 70% of our 250,000 is in that age bracket. So if we don't get them to work, we actually don't win in the market. So I think that, ours comes a lot more out of necessity. And I think, I do want to put in a caveat that I think technology industry works a little differently than most other traditional industries, because it's not something which is of today. Since the time that they were founded, they always attracted the youth. They always attracted the young engineers, the young entrepreneurs. It was in the forefront of technology. It was, it was in many ways where you grew the fastest, probably in comparison to a lot more other careers. Even today, probably straight out of an undergraduate, you earn much better, so it's highly aspirational. So I think it's not easier, because I think the youth is ever changing, but you have different ways to empower them. I mean, for me personally, I'm 43 and I'm a chair of a company, and our CEO is, 55, 56. I bring down the average age of my board, which would otherwise be about 62, 63. But, you know, I've got a Malaysian lady on my board. I've got Indian diaspora representation on the board, academics, people from financial institutions, myself just not being a tech person, and different tech. So I think when you talk about diversity, even amongst the youth, it's about where they come from. It's diversity of thought. Exactly. It's not, you know, you can have a company which is all youth, but if they're all homogenous, we're pretty much still stuck. If they're not heterogeneous, you're not actually sharing ideas, bouncing, being diverse. So that's number one. Just going back to the previous question that you were mentioning, and you know, we've talked about this. I strongly believe you cannot empower the youth through social media. You just cannot. You know, you have, everyone's hooked. You already have them there. Mm-hmm. But if you continue using that tool, you're actually not getting them out of the screen and in person. And if one of the things that you know, we talk about leadership is, and you know, like what you mentioned, power creates accountability and responsibility, and that further creates empowerment. But a lot of that has to happen when you, like the old days, roll up your sleeves, show up in person, and do the work. Not sit on social media and argue about 40 hours versus 35 hours. When you're young, older people arguing is one thing. They've put in time at some point in their age. You haven't even gotten there, and you're already complaining. You know, I want flexibility and I want work-life balance. You haven't even gotten married and have kids. Ask the parents here. Life balance. So I just feel, but you cannot empower them through social media. Yeah. So I think don't feed into that. You know, like you said, you know, get them to come, talk to them face to face. Let's discuss. Let's get them uncomfortable. Yeah. If you're behind a screen and you're on social media, you are very comfortable. You are sitting in your pajamas and getting angry. Okay? No. Come in your pajamas. I have no problem. But come in person. Yeah. You know, so, yeah, so that's what I think. But sure. Maybe
ironically, I think it's actually a really optimistic message.
Yeah.
Because, you know, you have a set of young people here, many of whom lost so much during the pandemic. In terms of not being able to have that face-to-face experience, whether that's at university, whether that's where you work. And so that's what I see as well when I speak to young people. They want to be in the room, they want to be face-to-face with decision makers, because that's how you learn and that's how you grow. Speaking of young people, I've taken up too much time, so I want to go to you guys. So any hands in the room, we'll take them now, and we'll reward the people sitting up front first. Can I go to you, sir?
Do you want a mic?
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. I'm Vritik Garg. I'm 23 and an MBA student studying in India. So my first question is from Roshni ma'am, the lady in front of me. So you talked about abundance of education and knowledge in India. And being the market leader in India about technology, what is your take on the scarcity of annual packages in India, where you see the annual package starts from 4,000 USD per year? And being the leader, what's your take on that? Like, the packages are stagnant when you talk about engineer freshers, but when you see the packages for the top executives, they are increasing like year on year, but the package at the bottom stays the same. So how do you see that?
So I talked about abundance of young youth, but I didn't talk about abundance of education. I didn't. So there is a gap in India, and everyone who's here from India, quality versus quantity. And when we are looking at, let's say, the market that we target to bring talent, it isn't the entire young population of India. Actually, the pool is much smaller. And over there, you are constantly struggling with other companies, and not only that, lots of companies setting up shop in India for the best talent. So what is happening is not necessarily a reflection on one company or another company. It is the competitive and complex dynamics of what's happening in the market. So, and because the quality is still a very small population. So that's why I was saying that when I was design thinking for Tech Bees, I was trying to solve for this constraint. So while you say a fresher is only getting $4,000, my Tech Bees, who are grade 12 students, not engineering, are getting the same. So look at what it's doing to them. So it's design thinking talent. And I think all companies are thinking about this. Will we move in an improved direction? We will. But that direction also might be very different, because in technology, as you're seeing, some of those entry-level jobs are also getting replaced by automation. So education and skilling has to catch up with what the industry requires for this problem to actually be solved. So it's, as an industry, there's only so much we can do. But we also need education and skilling to catch up and increase the pool. So till that happens, I will only attempt to design think where to get people from.
Thank you.
I also remind people to sort of state your name, your affiliation, and who your question is directed to, so we can get through as many questions as possible. And maybe in the interest of time, we'll sort of take 2 questions at a time for now. Could I ask the gentleman in the back and the lady in the row behind him, please?
Hi, my name is Christina Huget. Thank you for your time today. I am part of the Leaders of Tomorrow cohort, and I'm also a political risk consultant at Eurasia Group. We often discuss the impact of the rising middle powers on the world, and so I found the different insights today very valuable. But I'd really love to know, really, everybody on the panel, what you thought about the opening session, where there was an argument made that we need to return to our traditional rules-based multilateral structure. Do you think a transformation is coming? And if so, what does it look like? Do you think it calls for the development of a new structure, or, more conservatively, a change to the rules of the traditional institutions that we already have? Thank you.
Do you want to take the second question, or should I go ahead?
Yeah, let's take the second question as well, and then we can...
Thank you very much. My name is Billion Agonia from Nigeria. I'm a corporate lawyer, and I'm affiliated with EasyPay International Services Limited. It's a fintech corporation, and I'm pursuing a research on comparative petroleum and environmental law at master's level. My question is directed to Alexander, because in the course of the discussion, he mentioned that Switzerland has taken step-by-step measures in achieving the level of progress that it has achieved today. So my question is, what are these specific measures? Because since my stay in Switzerland, I'm really impressed with the level of infrastructure and the development. So I'm interested to know the specific measures that Switzerland has taken to achieve this level of success, and what lessons can young and developing countries learn from the measures that Switzerland has taken, particularly in addressing the numerous scarcities confronting these countries. Thank you.
Those are 2 heavy questions, so I'll open it up to the panel. Whoever wants to take it, I don't want to...
Yeah, so I'm a big, to the lady at the back, I'm a big believer in contingencies. So, we can call for the reform of the traditional multilateral institutions, and then we can wait to see if that reform happens. But I think one of the ways that from the demand side you can push that reform is by establishing alternative institutions, establishing alternative channels for engagement. So, where the G20, the UN, the IMF, the World Bank are failing countries of the global majority, there is an opportunity for them to exert their own majoritarian and their own economic heft by setting up institutions that do that same work amongst themselves, or in a reconfigured manner that doesn't lean on the post-war kind of frame of East versus West, North versus South. And I think once you do a little bit of the latter, the building new institutions, the forming new engagements, the more likely you are to see transformation of the old institutions. And if that transformation is too slow, you're sitting with an alternative methodology that you can work with going into the future.
I'll take the Switzerland one. I'm not Swiss, so but I'll give it my best shot. I think it's actually quite straightforward. Switzerland has a North Star, and the North Star is, and some may think it's about money, it actually isn't. It's a society that is saying to everybody who participates in it, this is going to work. Everything in this nation and the political leadership in society has a bar, and the bar is we're all committed to actually this nation working and the different aspects of the nation working. And if it doesn't, you can hold us accountable immediately, right? With a direct democracy and so on and so forth. And that is something that in a world where increasingly things aren't functioning are becoming ever more valuable. That is why a lot of people from around the world are constantly coming into this country, emigrating into the country, because they're saying, listen, common sense, clear North Star, and it's going to work. And rule of law, judging and treating everybody exactly the same, are foundational and non-negotiable. And that is why I believe Switzerland will be a very successful nation for years and decades to come.
Sorry, your answer about Switzerland has actually reminded me, I didn't answer the second part of your question about the rules-based order, right? Having a North Star, having rules requires consistency and the application of those rules consistently across circumstances. And I think you don't have to be ideologically pulled in one or the other direction to feel that the massacre and the conflict in Gaza has been handled differently to the massacre and the conflict in Ukraine. So if we have international rules-based orders, do we apply them equally, or do we rely again on the old allyships of the post-war era and on old relationships to make decisions about who breaking the rules-based order is in violation of them and who isn't? And so I think that's one of the ways in which, calling for a return to those rules can only be amplified by an equitable application of them.
I think that goes back, just to jump in as well, Lindiwe, to such an important point that's sort of underlying what you said, which is the inclusion of the global south and reconfiguring sort of our global political architecture around them isn't just a moral obligation, it's also a strategic necessity. This is the majority of the world's population, and we've seen that when disillusioned, they're not afraid to carve their own path in the world. It's exactly, I sort of recall when Ukrainian leader Zelensky went to Congress 2 years ago. He first made a moral obligation sort of argument about why the West should be supporting Ukraine, but then he's also said, this isn't just a charity or a nice to have, this is a strategic investment in the rules-based order that needs to be preserved everywhere around the world for it to really have any integrity, any teeth in the system. Let's take some more questions. We've got the gentleman here with his hand up. Just got a mic coming.
So, good morning to all the guests present here. I'm Yash Makaria from India, and I'm an MBA student there. So, my question will be open to all the panelists. So, as we have talked a lot about youth here right now, and we have a saying like the passion of youth and the experience of elders can do wonders. So, even you mentioned the youth should given the power, but you mentioned the youth shouldn't given the position. So what do you think whenever it comes to decision-making places, a lot of times there would be conflicts between the youth and the experienced person. So do you think in the future there should be a position for a youth on the table? It's open to any of the panelists here.
Yeah, I mean, again, I'll answer from my own experience. So when I first ran for opposition leader, I ran against an older white male leader who was my nemesis then, but we're very friendly now. And I remember there was a lot of push from inside my party that the incumbent should step down and make way for like a new generation of leaders. And I was really conflicted about it, and I went to see another older white male leader in my party to ask what he thought. And he says, no, you have to beat him. You have to win this election. Because if anybody in the organization feels as though this was given to you on a silver platter, that you didn't earn it in a competitive democratic process like every other leader either has or has been seen to participate in, you immediately undermine yourself and you walk in as a lame duck. So I'm a big believer in promoting young people, in elder leaders creating space for young people, but I also believe that young people have a duty to themselves and to each other to engage in the work, the hard work of showing up, being competitive, losing in some cases and winning in others, in order to secure the legitimacy able to enable them to govern and lead effectively.
Can we go to the lady in the middle row right there, please? And then secondly, we'll take you up front.
Hello, my name is Roshni Rawat. I'm also a high school alumni and a lecturer. And I have a question directed towards Roshni, and that is because I'm deeply concerned about the welfare of the youth, especially the students. And my question is also related to the well-being of all the international students. So it's definitely very empowering when you earn money, especially in the young age, but is it really good for them, for the students? Because I truly believe in the educational old models. There is a middle school, high school, college, and university, and we get a good chance to enjoy our life, to learn things in a little bit slower way. But there is a quality in our life. But when after 12th, like recently I've met a student who had a contract from a company right after 12th class. He was earning a good package. He was super happy. But on the other side, he also had another file in his hand, which was much thicker, and that was a medical report from the doctors. He had multiple of medical issues because he has been struggling to get to this position right after his 8th standard. And I felt it terrible that it's okay to earn a little bit late, but if this cat-mouse race of being youth and earning and going ahead, but in the meantime, until you reach your 30s or 40s, you are already half mad or in the hospital. And so it's not for all. I'm not talking for all, but I am talking because of my concern for the well-being of the students, international students. Thank you.
So,
Can we just get the second question? Really quick?
okay, you want to get the second question? Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for your time. It was a very thoughtful or thought-provoking, I should say, discussion, as you can tell with the number of questions. So my name is Anushka Purohit. I'm ethnically Indian, but I live in Hong Kong, which is what I'm representing. And over there, I run a small business that collects surplus bread and uses it to brew beer. And I'll tell you why that's relevant in a few minutes. But my question is more to Roshni and Alexander as the representatives of relatively large organizations. I think in today's time, lots of organizations focus on youth empowerment within or for people who are going to be within their organization. But I'm curious to know what both your organizations do for those youth who might not be directly impacted by your organization. So as an example, I know HCL has a lot of supports for grants, a lot of competitions, and the same for FGS Global. But have there been instances of youth pitching ideas in those segments that have actually been able to benefit from the incredible network that both your organizations bring? And were you able to maybe integrate some of that technology to empower them through the amazing experience that both of you and your companies have?
Okay, thank you. Okay, so let me come back to you. You know, in my other life, I also run 2 universities and 8 schools in India. And when you talk about mental health of the youth and young students, it starts with the mental health of parents and family back home. And a lot of critics, for a lack of a better word, don't acknowledge that. When kids are burdened or they are under pressure, umpteen number of times parents will come to the school or to the college and say, you're putting too much pressure on my kids. I always turn it around and says, the child is with us, let's say, 8 hours a day. The rest of the time, the child is back home. What are you doing? And I think that's very critical. When I talk about Tech B, at least in my case, my kids are going to university on Saturdays and Sundays. I am not making them study. So, at least for us as an Indian, I highly value education. But the discussion around mental youth and what's happening with students across the world is not just a reflection of their experience in the workplace or in the educational institution. It's the kind of pressures that are coming from the home. And it's also the kind of pressures that adults around them are dealing with. So I think that you can't look at it in a silo, but you have to look at it in what is happening in the ecosystem. And, but again, I think that there are limited hours in a day. So, it's also what you choose to do in those limited hours. So when you're not under pressure and when you're not, into your books or being pressured to perform or do well, what do you do with the rest of your time? And I think today, and this doesn't apply just to the youth, but even to young adults or even adults, is the rest of the time, are you going out and playing sport or going and being sociable with a bunch of people? Or are you hanging out on Instagram and figuring out what everybody else is posting? What are you doing? You do have, let's say, even between, 5 hours of work, 20 minutes, if you show up to work and you don't work from home, then you have, let's say, a couple of hours of work in meeting, but then you take a coffee break. And that's when you socialize. That's when you speak to other people. That's when you meet. So I think when you talk about mental health and what's happening, a big function of that is that people are socially disconnected physically. And I think they need to become a lot more connected socially, physically. And as for the hard work, and I know from our own parents, it wasn't easier in their generation. They worked bloody hard. But guess what? They didn't have distractions, which kept them steady. It made them physically make an effort to step out, or do something. It changes your orientation, change your environment. So I think hard work is always going to be there. You mentioned you have to work. It's always going to be highly competitive. There's always going to be someone better than you. And in some cases, you'll have skills which are better than everybody else's. The idea is to recognize talent, and then passion can follow. But make sure you hone that talent so that you can reduce pressure and get off social media. Yeah.
Actually, let me build on that, because it is such a critical point, and it's seldomly addressed in such clarity as you just expressed it, and I applaud you for it. It's, anybody here, sitting here, looking at athletes, from football players, cricket players, whatever it may be, Olympians, etc., right? They are 1 in 10,000, right? That's what that ratio is. And all of us will say, well, obviously they need to regenerate. Obviously they need rest times and all that kind of stuff, and it is part of the rhythm. And anybody who works with them, whether it's trainers or families who are supportive, the teams, etc., they fully recognize it and they foster it. But when you say, I would take the position, anybody working with their brain and being 1 in 10,000 is as much of an athlete or an outperformer as they are, possibly even more so. But when you then say, and oftentimes I find it's a challenge, it's probably not just the parents, it's the individual. Tell the individual, listen, and to any individual here in the room, I think all of you will find yourselves in this a little bit, take that room without guilt. I think getting over that guilt personally and saying, no, I do need to regenerate, that is going to allow me to continue to be better, is absolutely critical. And then maybe quickly to your question earlier, listen, and it's a combination of both of yours, look for an organization that is not just looking at you as somebody who brings in hours and performance, but an organization that looks for growth. And that is not just institutional growth, but also your growth and complete growth. So I can just say, everybody around me knows I will not have fullest respect for you if you're just fantastic at work. The respect I will grant upon you is if you as a human being, but also as somebody with a footprint in society and a positive footprint in society are bringing to the game. And then I will say, okay, you are somebody who truly is thinking in a multi-generational manner. And that then comes down to who do you choose to take on leadership positions in a multi-generational institution, whether it's politically, academically, in the business world, et cetera. You are looking for those individuals, and their age doesn't matter. It's the individual who brings that 360-degree view to the game. And I think that would be the best way of choosing individuals everywhere.
Just to follow up on that, Alex, I mean, how do you, say you're in the shoes of one of the young students here, how do you identify that? How do you identify a company that is actually willing to invest in your growth, rather than one that just sees you as an expendable employee. And I'm asking that because I've been, a young person applying to a dozen of these companies. From the outside, they all look the same. They all have the same CSR, ESG policies, right? But you help these companies do the sort of corporate reputation branding. From the other side, how do you identify it?
In your interview process. So any fantastic organization you're going to be with, they're going to spend time. So human beings are going to spend time with you to figure out if you are a match. And I would say 99.9% of individuals who go into those talks, all they're worried about is, okay, I need to do really well, prepare myself for the questions, etc. And they're not in trying to get their message and their pitch across. Instead of saying, you know what, I also want to find out what type of organization is it on the other side. And the biggest disconnect I see there is, amazing young talent sitting across from you and saying, so what are you going to do for me? That's not going to get anyone anywhere, because it actually shows that you're not fully cognizant of the situation, because the company has the choice. But if you go in and say, listen, what is important to you? How do you develop your talents? What would your expectations be of me? And not just next year, but in 3 years, in 5 years, etc. Then you get to know the character of an organization. So do that due diligence. I think answering that question that you just posed will become eminently easier.
Yeah. And
can I just add? And another thing for all of you to think about is, what you want to do in the organization for you to grow. So how you add to that culture and tweak that. So for example, even today, when you guys are applying for jobs at some of the top organizations, when you look at the CEOs or the CFOs or some of the top leadership, don't ignore the fact that in many of those organizations, a lot of those CEOs and CFOs have homegrown. And because they've homegrown, they have also committed a certain tenure to that organization. So if you're going into the organization to just say, what can the organization give for me? Am I going to grow, not grow? And then you know what? When the times are tough, I'm done. I'm moving to the next organization. They're paying me 25% more. Then I'm not asking you to be committed to the organization. You're not committed to yourself to actually want to grow in the organization. Do you enter an organization to say that, one day, maybe it's not the best organization. Maybe culturally it isn't the sexiest company. But one day, if I were the CEO of this company, this is what I would do differently. And this is how I would do culture. Then you're taking on a self-challenge. So I think that it is a contract, and it's a mental and a social contract that you are also signing when you're going into an organization, or what you can do to the organization to make sure that you get to that C-suite. If you don't have that kind of commitment, then everything is short-lived. And don't undervalue resilience and patience. Even an organization remembers, whether it's an old employee or a young employee, who stuck on during the bad times. The good times, everybody sticks on. So, yeah.
So I see 5 minutes left on the clock now, and so I'm going to use moderator's privilege to sort of ask the last question to the entire panel. I mean, when I came here last year, the cliche question to ask at the end of something like this is, there's all these young people in the room, what's your advice for young people? But I'm not going to ask that, I'm going to ask the opposite. Because you also have an entire generation of current business and political leaders in the room. We've talked so much about leading with keeping the next generation in mind. So what's the one piece of advice that you have gotten at some point from a young person that has been most impactful in shaping your approach to leadership? Lindiwe, can I start with you?
Yeah, so I am very fortunate in that I run an organization that supports young people to run for office. I also have a very young team. And youth is transient, guys. It's ephemeral. One day you're in your 20s, next year 44. So I'm no longer a youth. I was one once, but I've been amazed by how my younger team members are unapologetic about the need for rest. When it's time for them to take time off, they don't make excuses or caveats. They put in for leave, and they state unapologetically that they will not be available for this period. And that is not a culture that I come from. I come from a culture of toxic busyness, of toxic, constantly moving, constantly traveling, constantly working. And I think one of the challenges we sit with today is like mental health and burnout challenges in the workplace, in society, because of that toxic culture of work without cease. So that to me is, I think, one of the biggest lessons I've learned from my team, paradoxically, as somebody who has to approve their leave, is that despite the power imbalance, despite the need to appeal to the powers that be for that rest time, they do so unapologetically, and then they take it seriously. They actually don't take calls, don't answer emails, come back refreshed, ready the next day, and able to deliver effectively. And I find that as a consequence, when they are working, they're not doing it at 60% or 70%. They're 100% on the mark every time. But likewise are 100% serious about self-care, self-rejuvenation.
Yeah, and to a group of students that's so ambitious, but probably also most prone to the same kind of burnout. I think that's great advice. Alex?
Thank you for giving me some time. Maybe a fun one was, I would say 10, 15 years ago at Harvard, a whole bunch of leaders there, students, etc. Afterwards, we had dinner, and one of at smaller tables, and one of the students said, well, statistically speaking, and there were two other CEOs at the table with me, statistically speaking, you guys have peaked. So it's very, very unlikely that you, and I was in my late 30s, right? It's like that you will repeat your performance between 20 and late 30s over the next 20 years. And I was like, okay, that's I love it bold, right? Let's have a conversation about it. And his key thought was, you actually are not going to have youthful eyes at looking everything. You're just going to see things from the top. You're not going to see them from the bottom anymore, and things will surprise you. You're not going to be able to, be curious anymore. I said, okay, my favorite question to ask in the world is why? And then I don't mind digging in. But it allowed me, for myself, to develop a protocol to really say, okay, number one, no exceptions. Whenever I see and feel ivory tower anywhere, I walk the other direction. Like, literally, no matter what happens. When people organize drivers and stuff, it felt uncomfortable for me this morning because I know how to use the Uber app, right? And as a symbol, why should I be treated different than anybody else? And if you're treated like everybody else, you see other people's problems, maybe not as clearly and as intensely every day, but you are exposed to them. And that is the beginning. That was for me what I took away from that. Always, stay on it and then be very, very open to the things that are maybe in your peripheral vision, where you're like, oh, it's not really important now, but you're hearing it's important to others. Dive in. Absolutely dive in and say, listen, be conscious about it. And that's how I answered that for myself.
Yeah. Roshni, with 2 minutes left on the clock.
30 seconds. So I feel I'm in that middle age, in the 40s, where in most given rooms, the leadership which is around me, even in our industry, is actually older than me. But I am also not too young of the industry that I represent. What I have taken away from the youth and people who are, let's say, in their 20s or much younger, which I wish I could say much more with the older generation, is their ability to be inclusive. They are including me. They're much more inclusive, much more open to diversity, much more open to, much more fluid in the way they think. And that is something that you're trying to tell a lot more of the older generation to be. And some of that actually comes from habit. And I think that given the younger generation and the way they live, and the way that they are connected, and the way they navigate across common issues, it represents a certain inclusiveness, which you don't see. So for me, it's just being included and seeing how that is, and how one can help adapt that for older generations and settings.
Sure.
Yeah.
Something that comes to mind when I meet all the young leaders here is that they're really inclusive of different kinds of diversity, race, gender, ethnic, religion, you name it. But most of all, they're so radically inclusive of diversity of thought. right? Unlike possibly any generation before, when I meet young people, they want to be challenged, they want to challenge, they want to engage in a combative, frank, honest conversation. They don't want to just gloss over the surface, and they're very aware of the privilege they have to be at forums like these. So what a great note to end on. Before I let all of you go to lunch, let me remind you that the conversation does not end here. And I'm looking specifically at all the current business and public sector leaders in the room. Once again, I keep reiterating this. You have got 200 of the best and brightest from the next generation in this room for the next 2 days. So I have a bit of homework for you. We're going to move to lunch. We have an hour. When you go to lunch, I want all of you to walk up to 2 or 3 different leaders of tomorrow. Someone you have not met before, just walk up cold. They don't bite, I promise. And I want you to ask them 2 questions. I want you to ask them one, firsthand, what does the next generation actually care about most? And number 2, what is the one tangible, concrete, measurable thing that you can do, that you can implement in your organization to make sure that youth voices are systematically included? Can we please get a huge round of applause for our panel?